Burn the ships! There is no retreat! We conquer New Spain, or we die!
Have mercy, Captain!
The greatest stories in history often begin with men who disobeyed. The man in our story is one such figure, Hernán Cortés. In this tale, it wasn't just an empire that was destroyed. Wrong decisions, legends, and a tiny microbe shifted the balance of the world. When Columbus set foot in America, Spain was consumed by the New World fever. Everyone was chasing gold. But among these gold hunters, there was one who didn't just want gold. He wanted an empire. The governor of Cuba, Velázquez, had only given him an expedition mission. Do not under any circumstances establish a settlement. Do not under any circumstances engage in war. Just look and return. The moment Cortés received this order, he told the greatest lie of his life. "Certainly, Your Excellency," he said, "I will do as you command." Immediately after, he gathered the largest fleet he could find, borrowed and spent all the money he had, and secretly set sail from the Caribbean. He left the governor raging behind in the Atlantic Ocean. When Cortés reached the coasts of modern-day Mexico, the moment that would define his destiny arrived. A part of his crew wanted to turn back out of fear. Cortés looked at them and did something that Spanish soldiers watched with horror. He burned all his ships. But not slowly. By dismantling them, he surrendered them to the flames. There was no turning back now. They would either return to Spain with the Aztecs' gold, or they would die in this new land. History books say he sank the ships. In truth, he burned them. This was the story not merely of a sailor, but of a gambler who risked everything. Before you, Hernán Cortés, the man who overthrew one of history's greatest empires with a handful of adventurers. Just as every epic begins with a betrayal, Cortés's rise began with that great betrayal of Governor Velázquez. His goal, for the sake of wealth and glory, was not a legal exploration but an illegal invasion. But how was he going to accomplish such a massive undertaking with just 600 men? The answer was not in logistics or superweapons. The answer was hidden in the hatred of the Aztecs. Not all of these 600 men were voluntary adventurers. Some were indebted. Some were forced soldiers, and others were simply captivated by the lure of gold. Cortés led them by perfectly reading their balance of fear and hope, frightening the weak and giving hope to the strong. The Aztec Empire, though magnificent and rich, was despised by its neighbors due to its bloody rituals and obsession with human sacrifice. When Cortés landed, he took a native interpreter named La Malinche with him. This woman had learned the Aztec language, Mayan, and quickly, Spanish. She was a weapon as valuable as gold to Cortés. Because Malinche whispered to him, "If you want to reach Tenochtitlan, take those who are their enemies to your side." Thus, Cortés forged an alliance with the Tlaxcalans, the Aztecs' greatest enemies. For the Tlaxcalans, this alliance was not a romantic union. They were driven by 10 years of oppression and a thirst for revenge against Aztec domination. Cortés used this to transform a small Spanish pocket into a colossal native force. A handful of Spanish soldiers suddenly turned into an army of tens of thousands of native warriors. Those marching on the Aztec Empire were no longer Europeans, but a native army seeking revenge in a civil war. It was the autumn of 1519. The march had lasted for weeks, and on November 6th, the moment arrived. The Spanish reached the Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan. The sight before them was a dreamlike city that would put Venice to shame. It was built on lakes, with white buildings, hundreds of thousands of inhabitants, and gleaming gold temples. One Spanish soldier wrote of what he saw, "We were not sure if the things we saw were real or a dream." Waiting in the heart of this magnificence was the Emperor Montezuma. Montezuma panicked when he heard these strange foreigners had arrived. Aztec mythology included a prophecy that one day a bearded, light-skinned god, Quetzalcoatl, would return from the east. Even if Montezuma did not believe Cortés was a god, he at least suspected he might be an emissary of a divine power. This suspicion was his biggest mistake. Cortés and his 600 men entered the heart of a hostile empire, received as guests. Cortés read this gesture as a weakness. His strategy was incredibly simple and unbelievably audacious. He took Montezuma hostage in his own palace, in front of his own guards. Surprisingly, Montezuma submitted to this situation. Perhaps he believed in the prophecy, or perhaps he was terrified by the psychological advantage created by the Spanish cannons, muskets, and horses. Cortés began to rule the Aztec Empire through the captive emperor. Treasures now flowed, and Spanish soldiers plundered the temples. However, this audacious hostage-taking was unacceptable to the Aztec nobles and people. They no longer felt fear but rage. They would not allow this foreigner from across the ocean to defile their gods. The captive Montezuma was either stoned to death by his own people or murdered by Cortés. The friendship was over. The people of Tenochtitlan began to revolt. The Spanish decided to flee the city. The famous Night of Sorrows, La Noche Triste, took place on the night of June 30th, 1520. Cortés and his men were caught while trying to secretly escape across the city's canals, laden with the gold they had collected. Aztec warriors sprang from everywhere. The canals were filled with the corpses of Spanish soldiers who had sunk under the weight of their gold armor and horses. Cortés managed to escape but lost a large part of his army. It is said he wept when he looked back. After this great defeat, there was only one thing Cortés should have done: flee. But he was a man who had burned his ships. He returned. He reinforced the Tlaxcalan alliance, received new reinforcements, and began the siege of Tenochtitlan. It was precisely at this time that the tiny enemy that had traveled across the ocean and changed the course of history was already at work: smallpox. This disease, to which the Spanish immune system was accustomed, was raging among the Aztecs. It had killed a third, perhaps even half, of the city's population. By the time the siege began, the Aztecs were already too weak, hungry, and sick to fight. The Spanish had cannons and horses, but the Aztecs' true enemy was an unseen microbe. Montezuma was dead, Cortés was wounded, and he had lost most of his army. But he did not give up. This time, he returned more strategic, more ruthless. To recapture Tenochtitlan, Cortés this time applied a naval version of his burning the ships strategy. The city needed to be besieged from the lake. The Spanish, along with their Tlaxcalan allies, dismantled the ships on land, transported the pieces, and reassembled them on the lake surrounding the capital. These small warships, the brigantines, were a nightmare for the Aztec canoe fleets. That final siege, which lasted 93 days, was one of the most brutal in history. While the Spanish demolished the city with cannon fire, the Aztecs fought heroically under their last emperor, Cuauhtémoc. But hunger, gunpowder, and most importantly, the devastation caused by smallpox, broke their resistance. The disease had crushed the Aztecs both physically and psychologically. On August 13th, 1521, Tenochtitlan fell. An empire that had lasted for several centuries ended with an invasion and epidemic that lasted only a little over 2 years. Cortés's conquest was not a war, but a combination of genocide and technological superiority. So, what was Cortés's end like? Was he received as a hero? No. He became the governor of New Spain, Mexico, but the Spanish crown sought to limit his power. Just as the crown did to China's Zheng He, who we discussed in our first video, the king became jealous of Cortés's power. He began to be seen as a great threat to the king. The last 20 years of his life were spent fighting countless lawsuits filed against him and trying to regain his power in Spain. Despite the enormous wealth he acquired, he was constantly sued. His rights were restricted, and he was sidelined by Spanish bureaucrats. A man who conquered oceans was doomed to lose in the corridors of the court. In 1547, he died in a village in Spain, away from his former power as a defeated conqueror. In solitude, he had burned the ships, but it was his own people who burned him. Cortés's actions changed the destiny of an entire continent. He was the beginning of Latin America and the end of the Aztec civilization. Historians still debate, what if smallpox had not existed? What if the Aztec army had survived that great epidemic and defeated the Spanish army at the beginning? Perhaps today, Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, would be spoken in North America instead of Spanish. If Mexico had remained the greatest empire of the 16th century, perhaps the economic and cultural balance of today's world would be entirely different. Perhaps an Aztec emperor could have sailed to the shores of Europe before Columbus. But these are all maybes. The truth is, Cortés did not just come with a sword. He was a strategic genius who carried a disaster within him. The recklessness he showed by burning his ships became the end of an entire civilization. However controversial his story may be, it remains one of the most ruthless and dramatic moments in the Western spirit of exploration. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this controversial figure of history, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and like our video. See you in the next video. Stay well.